I want to welcome everybody. We're going to give folks maybe one more minute to join us, and then I will look forward to introducing our guest speakers today. All right, let's go ahead. I'd like to welcome you to this event. I am Corinne Bendersky, Professor of Management and Organizations at the UCLA Anderson School and Faculty Director of HEART at UCLA, our Human Resources Executive Roundtable and HEART Diversity Network. Joining us today are HEART CHROs and their teams, DEIB leaders, Anderson faculty, staff, and HEART guests. As we begin, please share your questions in chat, and time permitting, I'll pose them to the speakers on your behalf. As part of our HEART DEI and Belonging Network, we're really pleased to present ongoing in-depth programs on various issues impacting diversity, inclusion, and belonging for all employees in the workforce. If you would like to join our DEIB network, please let us know in the chat and HEART will contact you with details. As organizations implement new DEIB strategies, many leaders overlook the importance of incorporating transformational change approaches into their plans. Most DEIB leaders know that transformational change is achieved when DEIB is ingrained in the culture, systems, and processes of an organization, not thought of as a standalone topic. This is the foundation of how we do business. Today's expert panel will discuss what works, what barriers to avoid, and how leaders can effectively create lasting DEIB change. Our expert panel will discuss various approaches that are discussed in the recently published book, The Secret Sauce of Leading Transformational Change. The book highlights the practical experiences of several hundred leaders who share their expertise on the art and science of leading transformational change. This book's website is listed in chat along with a purchase discount code. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our distinguished speakers. Ian Ziskin is President, Executive of Exec Excel Group, which has 40 years of experience as a business leader, board advisor, and member, coach, consultant, entrepreneur, teacher, speaker, and author. He is the co-founder and partner of Business Insight Group, co-founder of the Consortium for Change, and co-founder of the CREATE Project. His global leadership experience includes CHRO and other senior leadership roles within 3 Fortune 100 companies, including Northrop Grumman, QS Communications, and TRW. He is a Master's of Industrial and Labor Relations degree from Cornell University, and a magna cum laude degree from Binghamton University with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Management. In addition, we have with us Karen Jaw-Madson. She is Principal of Co-Design of Work Experience, author of Your Culture, Innovating Experiences at Work, and founder of the Future of Work platform, a new HR. She is an executive coach and instructor at Stanford University's Continuing Studies program. She empowers organizations through coaching and developing leadership, enabling them to leverage culture, diversity, and employee experience, optimizing their talent, and driving change management and transformation. Our third guest is Sophia Kristjansson. She's the founder and principal of Lexicon Lens. She works with leaders to maximize organizational potential. She's the Lexicon Lens is a boutique consulting firm in DEI, change management, and people development. She's also a member of the faculty at the University of Denver in organizational leadership, strategic HR practices, and diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices. What an erudite and excellent panel we have today. So I'm going to go ahead and facilitate a sort of a fireside chat with our guests. And again, if you joined us a little late, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, and I will do my best to bring them to our panelists. So I'm going to actually start things off with Ian. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning here in LA. I was hoping that you could start by talking about what is transformational change, and what are the 3 most important factors that leaders should consider when implementing DEIB strategies.
Well, great to be with everybody. Thanks a million for having us on the panel. Let me begin with just a little bit of context before I get directly to your question, Corinne, about what is transformational change. When we started working on this book, The Secret Sauce for Leading Transformational Change, one of the things we were trying to get our arms around were a series of questions to be answered. Ranging all the way from unexpected kind of questions, such as what does pizza have to do with leading transformational change? And maybe we have some time, we'll come back to answering that in a little while, but also some more fundamental basic questions, such as what do leaders who are highly successful at leading transformational change actually do? In addition, thinking about it from the opposite perspective, why do we so often fail to successfully lead transformational change, and what's behind that failure? We also had a bit of a hypothesis we were trying to get our arms around, which was the assumption that all transformation is change, but not all change is transformational. And it actually turns out, at least based on our analysis of the topic, not all change is transformational. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And probably my favorite question in all of this was from what to what, trying to get an understanding of not only where we're headed in the future in order to make ourselves as individuals or the teams that we work on or the organizations that we're part of more successful, but also where did we come from, and making sure that we aren't throwing away the baby with the bathwater, and better understanding what got us here to the place that we're at to begin with in the first place. So in doing all of this, we've become kind of fond of the phraseology 200 voices in under 200 pages. And the reason I mention that is because it speaks directly to what I think is a very important underlying philosophy of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which is trying to create a platform for a lot of different voices with many different, diverse, sometimes divergent or disagreeing perspectives to share their point of view on what leading transformational change actually is and is not. And so the panel that we have today, particularly Karen and Sophia and myself, I think we represent an example of the 200 or so voices that actually contributed to this book. Now, in piecing together the definition, here's something that became really important to me as the lead author of the book, which is you share a bunch of perspectives on leading transformational change. In some cases, it's connection to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and allow people to begin to formulate their own point of view about what a good definition of leading transformational change is. But since you asked the question, I'm going to answer it up front so people will use that as a context for the rest of the conversation. I tend to think about the whole concept of transformational change as basically rethinking and repositioning completely the what, why, how, who, when, and where of basically four things primarily, where you're essentially trying to dramatically improve these following four things, one or all of them. One would be effectiveness. Secondly, might be the happiness. Thirdly, might be the health. And fourth might be the ultimate survival of someone or something. And so when you think about completely rethinking and repositioning, and also the what, why, how, who, when, where associated with that, and trying to touch on the effectiveness and the happiness and the health and or the survival of someone or something, there's probably some underlying themes that should be jumping out at people as you're listening to the definition. One is the systemic nature of large-scale transformational change. It touches a lot of things. Secondly, it has to do with the comprehensiveness of the approach that you're taking. Thirdly, there's an implication for what I would describe as long-term sustainability, and ultimately has to do with what could you do to improve dramatically at the individual or the team or the organizational or perhaps even the societal level. So it touches a lot of comprehensive pieces in distinction from lots of other changes that we go through in our lives or in our organizations that might be very important, but they also might be much shorter term, much more narrowly defined, very specific definable tweaks that might improve things, or they might just be different, but not necessarily an improvement. So that's the way I tend to think about the definition of leading transformational change. Now, to the second part of your question about maybe 3 things to focus on. Obviously, we touched on a lot of things in this book that we'll have a chance to address over the course of the conversation, but I want to emphasize, 3 particular things that really jumped out at me as part of our exploration, and particularly with implications for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The first one actually came up very early in the book. It was part of the foreword that was written for the book by a gentleman by the name of Ron Sugar. He used to be the chairman and CEO of Northrop Grumman when I was the chief HR officer there, and he was nice enough to contribute to this book. And what he talked about was the importance of starting with the truth, talent, and timing. And here basically is what we mean by that. Most human beings have an almost limitless capacity to deny, deflect, dismiss, or in some other ways explain away facts or data that do not reinforce our preferred view of the internal or external environment. And therefore, one of the most important capabilities, whether it's around DEIB or whether it's around leading transformational change or both, is coming to grips with reality. The situation is what it is. We are where we are, whether we like the facts as they present themselves or not, being aware of, but also willing to address the facts and the situation as it is. Many individuals and many organizations have this tremendous capacity to ignore what's really in front of us, and that's extraordinarily important. The second piece of the equation from Ron Sugar's forward was around talent, which is the importance of surrounding ourselves with people who are smarter than us, who have capabilities and experiences and perspectives that are better than or different than in some way what we can bring to the party, because those are the individuals we're going to ride with to help us not only plan for, but execute large-scale transformational change. And this speaks directly, in my opinion, to the value of effective DEIB, because it's all about surrounding ourselves with people who have different capabilities and ways of thinking and enrich not only the conversation, but the solution that we're putting in place. Last point around timing goes something like this. Generally speaking, in order to successfully lead and execute transformational change, we're going to be asked to move at a pace that's uncomfortable. Generally, you're going to have to move faster than what we as individuals and what the organization historically has felt was appropriate or seemed about right in order to get the type of traction that's required to overcome a lot of the obstacles that generally are going to get in our way. So speed matters when it comes to leading transformational change. And it also matters, I think, in terms of setting the tone for the type of cultural change required in DEIB. Last couple of points I'll make to fill out your question, Corinne, about 3 things that we should be considering goes something like this. There's I think a common misconception that comes up over and over again on the topic of leading transformational change that goes something like this. Good leadership of change really needs to be about anticipation and preparation for and seeing around corners and connecting the dots between seemingly disconnected things. So it's a very forward-looking, anticipatory, and therefore seemingly more quote unquote strategic way of thinking about leading transformational change. And there's plenty of examples, not only in the book, but also in life, of successful efforts to lead big change where we were really able to anticipate it and see it coming. However, it turns out, not only in the book, but also in life, I think there are actually many more examples of situations where we were not well prepared, we didn't anticipate it, we didn't see it coming, Probably the best example of this that we can all relate to over the course of the last couple of years is COVID. I certainly wasn't smart enough to see COVID coming, but it basically changed our lives virtually overnight. And so in those circumstances, the question's really about, can you see reality? Can you face into it? How agile are you? How quick are you? How responsive are you to dealing with the constantly changing circumstance that you didn't necessarily see coming? And one of my favorite quotes that I think really illustrates this point was from Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight boxer, who was being interviewed by a member of the media in advance of one of his heavyweight bouts. And the question was basically, what's your strategy for the fight? And his response was, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I think there's plenty of examples of, we as individuals and the teams we're on and the organizations we're part of, and maybe even the society we live in, where we're constantly being punched in the mouth. And the question is, how responsive are we to dealing with the unexpected and painful sometimes punches that we're getting? And then the last point I'll make about one of three things to really focus on going forward is what I call in the book the idea of love, influencers, and resistors. Because one of the common traps I think we all fall into when we're trying to lead a big change, and I think DEIB is a perfect example of this, is we tend to gravitate toward and look for people who are like-minded, who support our view of things and how the organization should be operating and how we as individuals should be treated, which makes perfect sense. And so we have a tendency to look for people who think and act like us to a certain degree because we feel supported by having those kind of people around us. It also turns out, however, that there's, generally speaking, almost always resistors, people in the organization who are more skeptical, who ask tougher, sometimes unpopular questions, who are not likely to get on board right away. And most human beings, being the way we are, we have a tendency to dismiss those people pretty quickly. In some cases, we marginalize them. In some cases, we ignore them. In some cases, we think about how to push them away or out of the organization. We fire them, whatever it might be, to demonstrate that we expect support. And quite often, organizations do that much too quickly, and leaders, particularly when they come into new roles, do that much too quickly. They tend to dismiss people who are resistant. I'm the new sheriff in town. I want to show everybody that I'm in charge. And we miss out, frankly, on a lot of good questions and important perspective, even if it's a bit contrarian, that if we listened better and we responded better to that resistance and contrarian point of view, we'd actually be better prepared for dealing with some of the obstacles and inevitable mess ups along the way that leading big transformational change usually brings with it, because it is messy business. So last point I'll make about these influencers and resistors is that I often advise people to ignore the organization chart when they're thinking about leading large-scale transformational change, because if you over-rely on the organization chart, your approach tends to be rather hierarchical. And I see this happening a lot in DEIB efforts as well, which is our theory being, if we start with the senior leadership team, the CEO and their direct reports, and we cascade our way layer by layer by layer through the hierarchy, somehow or another, we're ultimately going to touch everybody in the organization. And I think there's a fair amount of truth to that. However, that only represents about 50% of the story, in my experience. The other 50% of success is about understanding who the influencers and resistors are, no matter where they sit in the organization, and they might be 9 layers down. They might not be in a leadership role. They might not be somebody that many of us have even heard of, yet they have huge influence on the perspective and thinking of everybody around them, because they have a lot of credibility and are well regarded by many other people. A lot of change efforts, and I think a lot of DEIB efforts as well, tend to overlook those influencers and resistors and tend to over rely on the organization chart as the target strategy for implementing and executing change. So those are some of my early thoughts in response to your question, Corinne, and I'll stop there and see if you have any follow-ups or if you want to hand it over to other panelists.
Thank you so much, Ian. I mean, I really appreciate you saying that in order to achieve large-scale transformational change, you have to embrace the inconvenient truths and figure out how to have those resistors and influencers, the right people in the room in part of the discussion, and anticipating as much as you can the future. Is a very, very helpful overview. I think let's take the opportunity to bring Karen and Sophia into our discussion at this point. And I'd love to, you guys, both in the book and your work, you have observed many examples of how transformational change has been applied in a lot of different industries. Could you each share some examples of both successful transformational change and maybe identify some barriers to avoid?
Sure. Karen, do you want to start or shall I? All right. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I would like to talk about successful change from a few different perspectives and building on what Ian has discussed already. One of the things that I think makes a successful DEIB strategy and is having an action plan and making that action plan align with business and people strategies so that you're not adding too many extra things to people's plates, but what you are adding links to the business and it links to a reason why people would want to consider changing their hearts and minds for what you're trying to accomplish. Because ultimately what you want in this process is the employee's voice. And I'll go back to that in a minute. I'd also like to stress that, you know, we have a tendency as human beings to want to boil the ocean. And we need to take a step back from that when we're looking at transformational change to focus in on what's doable and make it as simple as possible and as reasonable as possible. And that's why I stress connecting any DEIB action plan directly to the business and people strategy, because people are going to be focused on building, you know, more of a bottom line for the organization.
Sophia, do you have any examples that illustrate that? It's such an important point.
So yes, I work with an organization right now that is in the second year of building their DEIB strategy. And what we're doing in the change management process is to incorporate the employee's voice. So we're looking for those supporters and maybe some detractors. We're looking for what they think and feel, what's hard for them in their work, and how are we going to make that easier for them? What are the behaviors that are keeping them from contributing fully? And how can we influence change around that? So, and then we are also looking at how to embed DEIB practices into the business. So this happens to be a pharmaceutical company. How can we build in best practices around clinical trials and incorporating members of underrepresented ethnic groups into those clinical trials? How is that communicated out? Who are the people that need to be in the room to discuss that? And what is the organization's point of view for doing that? So we have a task force in place to actually handle that business problem that's been very important for the organization. I'd also say that there's another piece of this that is often overlooked, and that is that organizations have a tendency to focus in on the common elements of a DEIB strategy, such as an employee resource group and an inclusion council and a scorecard that holds leaders accountable for seeking, hiring, promoting diverse talent. And all of those things are very important, and organizations need to be successful at them. And in addition to that, there is what I call an equation to DEIB, which is that inclusion equals belonging and uniqueness. And I'm talking more on the team level now, but there's science pointing to the need to not only build a sense of belonging for individuals on teams, but also to recognize their uniqueness and what they bring to the table that's different than everybody else. And when that equation is balanced, when the two are balanced, then an employee, a team, feels a sense of inclusion, and that can have a rippling effect. And that kind of then language, behavior, and actions are what I'm looking for as the person who is leading the change, and then communicating that back out, reflecting that back out into the organization.
Thank you. That's really, yeah. Why don't we turn things over to Karen? Thank you so much, Sophia.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'll share some thoughts on at the organizational level, and then I'll share an example. Successful change really is about sustaining the desired shifts in time for as long as it's needed. So I want to emphasize that. That's a loaded sentence there, but I want to emphasize that it's not about permanence, but it's about positive progress, because organizations are changing all the time, right? So where they fall short is when they lose momentum before they achieve sustainability. Okay, and this can happen for a number of reasons. Most of the time, though, people are capable of change, even if there's blind political or ideological resistance. Where a lot of problems show up, though, is in the management of the change, right? So they haven't necessarily set the conditions for success. And the barriers I see most often are related to, first, attention span. So they, usually leadership, they lose interest too early, and they move on to the next crisis or shiny new object, right? It falls apart without enough support. So not sure how they can expect others to keep going if they don't, right? Another one is that they forget that it's not just an initiative to implement, but a relational process as well, right? So you have to meaningfully engage people before, during, and after change, and forge the kind of relationships within the company that foster trust and psychological safety needed for change. Another one is failure to learn, right? So they don't change and they don't learn from their mistakes. My definition of change is learning, and conversely, learning is change, right? And what I mean by that is that learning is not about just acquiring information and doing nothing with it. It's about encountering new knowledge and integrating it and changing your behavior and your actions in a way that otherwise wouldn't have happened if you hadn't gotten that information or knowledge. The last two I wrote about in my essay for The Secret Sauce. And the first is that, they just don't achieve sufficient depth. That is, they don't penetrate enough people in the organization at the individual team and organizational wise scales. And the second is about not having enough breadth. So depth and breadth. And that, what I mean by that is the momentum to keep the change going. So that means having the continuous content to feed that narrative, including things like systems, infrastructure, the culture, patterns of new behaviors, key messages, support, certainly new learning and stages of growth. That is why things like maturity models can sometimes help to define what happens and which milestones are needed to advance to the next stage. One of my favorite examples is that I like to share is actually written up in my book, Culture Your Culture, Innovating Experiences at Work. Thanks for mentioning that earlier. This was a client who realized that their written values did not align with their lived experience. So I worked with them for about 1.5 years to close that gap. But more importantly, I showed them how to engage and manage change through co-creation with their people. So Ian talked a little bit about the influencers and the resistors, and why sometimes top-down implementation is problematic. Co-creation creates this co-design dynamic, which is very different. It forges a different kind of relationship and certainly engages and connects people differently. And so that work was all about breaking silos, setting new expectations, empowering people, and making culture an ongoing priority. And it wasn't a perfect journey, no changes, by the way, right? Everyone knows that, but they iterated and they learned. And they were one of my first clients as a management consultant and executive coach. So this is going back to 2013 and 2014. This is right after I left my career as an HR executive. The update since the book came out in 2018 is that my stakeholder from that organization, who was the VP of Finance and Administration, they reached out after the pandemic was in full swing. And they shared how they believed the work we did way back when prepared them to weather the disruption that came with COVID-19 really well. So Ian talked about that as a great example. I don't think there's a greater example in recent history, right? But it's really on my list now to work with them to write up a case study, because it shows the sustainability of this kind of work, and in particular, my framework, design of work experience. So all this being said, I also want to caution readers in the book, and I'm going to caution everyone here now, is not to over rely on other companies' examples or even so-called best practice, right? So the people in the context for every organization, even those in the same industries and a lot of other common factors, they are always different and unique. So the key is in customizing the right combination of solutions and developing strategies that are specifically relevant and impactful to your one-of-a-kind organization. So that's me on my soapbox here, and I'm happy to entertain any follow-up questions, Corinne.
Thank you. Well, I mean, all three of you gave us so much food for thought. I'd like to reiterate an invitation to the audience. If anyone has questions for our panelists, you can go ahead and put them in chat, and I will moderate and bring them up as appropriate. I think while we're waiting for folks to formulate some questions for you, I would love if you could talk about sort of practical, concrete recommendations for starting these transformational change journeys with respect to DEIB. What are some things that you would recommend that managers and leaders do? And we heard a lot of recommendations in what you said, but so I personally am feeling a little bit overwhelmed at the scope of it, right? And so where do people start?
Maybe I'll take a crack at it, and then maybe Sophia and Karen can build or argue with what I say. So for me, it goes back to one of the fundamental principles I started with when we were talking about the origins of the book, which is this importance of voice, creating an environment where a lot of different, and in some cases, disagreeable perspectives are not only allowed to happen, but actually encouraged to happen. Why do I say that? Because a lot of DEIB efforts that I've been part of over the course of my corporate life or in my coaching and consulting life quite typically start with what I would describe as representation. We need to figure out how to make our senior leadership team and multiple layers of the organization more diverse in all dimensions. And I'm not arguing with the validity or the value of making senior leadership and all levels of an organization more diverse. I firmly believe in that. However, what I've seen over and over again is, 98% of the effort go into successfully or unsuccessfully making visible roles in the organization more diverse, and almost no effort going into building a culture and a work environment where we actually listen and take into account the input and the advice and the perspectives of the people who we're bringing into the organization to in fact promote diversity. And what you can quickly do if you mess up this balance is frustrate people to a point where they feel not only unheard, but marginalized and dismissed and ignored and unvalued. And, those people don't stay. And even if they do stay, maybe it's worse, they stay and they contribute in negative ways. So for me, one of the most important insights in all of this over the years has been getting the combination right, the balance right of creating a more diverse organization with all kinds of different perspectives to be offered, while at the same time, you're changing the environment culturally to be much more oriented to listening to what people have to say and acting upon it. And the last point I'll make about that before handing it over is, in all kinds of examples of successful transformational change, the emphasis on communicate comes up over and over and over again in endless examples. And of course, communication matters a lot. The only problem is most people tend to immediately gravitate toward tell. My role as a leader in the organization is to tell people about the compelling need for change and to sell them on the idea and also the difficult things that we need them to do to contribute to the change. Now, telling is important, but it's not nearly as important as listening. So listen, and listen some more if you want to successfully lead transformational change, and listen some more if you want to create an environment where DEIB actually gets some traction and is treated like it's real.
Yeah, I like that, Ian. I think I talk a lot in my own work with students and companies in my consulting work that, you can put a lot of resources into increasing representation, focusing on diversity. But if you don't have that inclusive culture, you're not leveraging the diversity. And so it's really it's just a waste of resources.
Yeah,
And
actually, one step worse, I would argue, Corinne, which is it's not only not leveraging diversity, but it's actually annoying the diversity.
Right, it's undermining it. Yeah.
To a point where that people feel really undervalued and diminished, which is exactly 180 degrees the opposite of what our original intent was when we committed to diversity in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. Sophia, let's go back to you. Any concrete recommendations for our managers and leaders getting started down this path effectively?
Sure. So Ian is so right about the listening. So that is the number one foundational skill that I believe everybody across the organization needs. It will help immensely. Building trust, I think, is another one, right? Examining situational leadership is another one. As far as the structures are concerned for a DEIB strategy, perhaps in year one, establishing an inclusion council. So building the voice out of the employee, choosing people who are from diverse backgrounds to serve on this inclusion council and have an executive sponsor who is a member of senior leadership, perhaps. I would also say that employee resource groups are a great way to help employees establish their voice, learn, grow, be mentored, that kind of thing. And to connect back, I can't stress this more, the actions and the development back to the business goals of the organization, and to steep the talent management activities and goals into what ERGs do. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that regard. I'd also say that the fun stuff, So heritage months and appreciation months, celebrating those actively and educating, taking the opportunity to educate and engage employees in activities around that is important. One thing that I'm not completely convinced about, which is unconscious bias training. We've heard a lot about that. We all know that it has limited success. And I would say if it is built into the behaviors that are being that are valued in the organization, that are being developed among leaders, then of course there's value to it. And with all of this, what I call the pull through is immensely important. So not just a standalone training or a standalone event, but pulling through every single thing that is being done in the DEIB space across the important elements of that employee's life cycle is very, very important and takes time. So work at the pace of the organization, figure out how to stretch it just enough. And I would also say, finally, to remember to engage those employee voices at all levels of the organization, both the detractors and the supporters.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the implicit bias training. I feel like it's a necessary but not sufficient thing.
Oh, no, not sufficient at all. And that could be the stepping stone for the transformational change that you're looking for in behavior across teams, right? Mm-hmm. So that is a way to engage people in what they learned, what they're doing, why some of it works, why it doesn't, to really get them to share their voice.
Yeah. Thank you. Karen, same question to you. Concrete recommendations for getting started.
So I give some starting points in my secret sauce essay for what can be done at the individual, team, and org level. So I will encourage you to read the book, and thought I'd share also that my essay is also being developed into an online course. So there's more to come there. But since you asked about where to begin, I would advise organizations to begin where you are today. And I mean that in two respects. The first is, don't delay. Okay, I get a lot of first this, then that, or we'll plan, or we'll budget for that next year. And, it's just, I happen to believe that culture and DEIB are reliant upon each other. And Ian was alluding to that earlier. And that is, you can't have a great culture without DEI and belonging, and you can't have DEI and belonging without a culture to support it. And so, like culture, you need to intentionally manage DEIB. It's still happening, right? So even if you're not doing anything about it, it's still happening. And if you don't manage it, it'll manage you one day. So things will blow up. You'll get punched in the mouth, to borrow from Ian's quote. And then you'll really have to deal with less than ideal circumstances, right? I'm especially disappointed, and I'll voice that now, is I'm really disappointed to see companies pulling back their DEI efforts lately, and so many chief diversity officers that are continuing to turn over and burn out. So I'm so glad that this group here is establishing a support system for it. So good on you for doing that, because I think it's necessary. But there is plenty of opportunity right now, and it's never a bad time to engage more with your employees. So just get started even when other things are in motion. So that's one. The second is a step that many organizations either skip or neglect to do sufficiently, and that is getting a deep dive of the current state and the conditions that are creating it. So I use the analogy of a GPS. So how can you get the directions if you don't know where you are and you don't know where you're going, right? So having that baseline done to ensure that your organization can be strategic about change, about being more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and to create the sense of belonging. It's not about checking boxes, right? And, you know, not without what Sophia called the pull through, right? You want to truly understand DEI priorities, what will be most relevant to the employees and to the business, and have the most positive impact, which is, by the way, a way that will support sustainable change. So the first phase of my framework, design of work experience, really provides the structure for this work. And I'm happy to talk to anyone who would like to learn more about it, but I will want to just put one last thing out there, and that is, you know, DEI and belonging can't be one person's job or a department's job to do. It has to be part of everyone and everything in order to achieve systemic change. And that's really why so much of these efforts fail, because they don't sustain that change systemically, right? So that's a source of extreme frustration for me, which is why I wrote the essay that I wrote. So hopefully that gives you some starting points, but just do something. Don't not do something. That's my big point here.
So the takeaway for me is to start transformational change, don't worry about being transformational right away. Like, take the first steps to get the ball rolling and realize it's a long process that built with interconnected parts that build on each other. So that what I'm hearing you saying is that you get potential clients who are not willing to get started because they don't have all the pieces in place at the outset. Is that right?
And do the baseline, and you'll know exactly what you need to do, right? So
Right.
there's this maxim in improv that says start anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Would you rather wait and, you know, have to be caught flat-footed to try to address something quickly and not be able to be prepared for it? Right.
Yeah.
So
Perfect. Great. Okay. Another question I have is many companies have ERGs in place, and I think Sophia, you spoke to the importance of those ERGs really being aligned and integrated into business practices. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some ways of doing that.
Certainly. So I'll speak to a mentorship program and also to business ideas that ERG members are sharing with leadership. So mentorship is often an issue for certain populations and organizations. And so developing a mentorship program that engages leadership or influencers within the organization and ERG members to help them grow is very effective in my experience. It helps the ERG member and even the mentor to develop their network more within the organization, to identify potential talent for development that they might not have known about. And the mentee gets the same kind of thing, right? So they get access to leadership that they might not have, or access to work groups and work that they might not have known about, that then propels them into more visible positions within the organization. So that's one thing. The second thing is business ideas. So, you know, to build this kind of muscle around innovation and building a learning culture, I like to see ERGs expose their members to the possibility of presenting a business idea to leadership to understand what works and what doesn't, what's relevant and what's not, right? And it can be a learning experience, it can be a development experience, it can be a success story. And I have witnessed 2 success stories in which leadership has seen a possibility, a business possibility from another perspective that they weren't aware of. And the ERG members these are 2 different individuals, ended up being promoted within the organization and led task forces to develop their ideas more. And so it stretches ERG members to really practice their goals, hone their leadership skills, their team management skills, and their business acumen. So those are kind of two business ways in which to develop your ERGs.
That's terrific. Ian or Karen, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
You want to start, Karen?
Sure. So Sophia answered it really well. So I'm just going to supplement what she said and point out that ERGs are also part of the employee experience. So therefore can be intentionally co-designed, implemented, and sustained. And, you know, with the help of the framework that I've put together, which doesn't prescribe, but provides enough of the support to help companies discover their own journey in the process in it. And that sometimes is as important as the outcomes that they're looking for. I encourage your organizations to provide the resources and the empowerment, because I've come across a lot of extremely underfunded ERGs. And so they're not put in a position where they can create the space where they can learn, or they need to learn, as Sophia said. So I've also done a lot of work with group coaching, which ERGs can sometimes embark in, that encourages them to not only lean and learn from each other, but to be able to create that sense of connectivity, right, with each other, which is so important in terms of building community at work.
Thank you, Karen. Ian, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, if I could, one of the things I'm a big believer in is, if you write a book, you hopefully teach people something that they might not have known before, but you should also be doing it with the idea in mind of learning some things that you didn't know before. And so there's a lot of ahas, in the experience of writing the book for me, one of which came up in so many different ways that relates very much to this idea of ERGs. And that is, every book about change I've ever read, there's a question somehow addressed about, is it really true that people hate change? And not to sound cynical, but I've come to the conclusion that most people actually do hate change. However, I've also come to the conclusion that as much as they hate change, most people actually hate failure even more. And so if you can appeal to people's desire to win, be part of a winning team, part of a winning organization, be a winner themselves, as individuals, you have at least a 51% chance of, getting people over the hump of hate, or at least resistance to change. The connection to ERGs here is really important, because I've had, a number of experiences over the course of my career where we were able to use ERGs to really help elevate the awareness of and hold up the mirror for the organization about places that the organization was failing and running the risk of not winning. In some cases, it was about the employee experience of, it's frustrating to work here. In other cases, it was very much more about the customer experience and what it's like for the average customer to deal with our organization, and it's not very user-friendly, and it's not very pretty, and here's all the reasons why it's not very user-friendly or pretty. And it raised the level of awareness about problems that were being fomented but ignored throughout the organization in multiple ways. And it really accelerated the organization's ability to move from fear of or hate of change to capitalizing on this hate of failure or potential failure. And ERGs really energized that feeling so that we were able to address the things that needed to be addressed. And that was extremely powerful. And by the way, it wasn't necessarily something that we set out to do when we set up the ERGs. It just evolved, as the level of comfort that people had around ERGs and their contribution to making it a better place.
Yeah, the power of sort of having a collective voice becomes very empowering, and then can shine a light on some blind spots that weren't
Right.
identified because people weren't comfortable talking about them. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, no, if I could just add to that, because I think ERGs are an antidote to isolation. So having coached people of color, leaders of color, even in the same organization, I saw such a big difference between people who had support systems and people who didn't. And so I think it's really important to leverage ERGs. Because that's part of the challenges with people who are diverse, is that they feel isolated or marginalized, to use Ian's term earlier, from the rest of the organization. So ERGs can play a really important role. I think generally, though, organizations are not fully leveraging the potential there. And I think that's worth looking into more.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for one more question here. This comes from our audience. The practice of putting DEIB success metrics in performance evaluations seems to be in the category of a task to get through instead of an initiative that creates sustainable change in the culture. I'd appreciate your thoughts on this and how to communicate success.
Who wants to start with that one?
I have thought.
You spoke first, so we're going to volunteer you.
Karen, go ahead. I know you said you have a question, and I'll follow up after you.
Well, you know, I think the issue with those, and I don't know what specifically they are for that particular organization. I think a lot of organizations really tend to emphasize the numerical measures, what's called quantitative, and they don't really even consider qualitative measures, which, truth be told, and I'm a researcher, can sometimes be more stringent than quant, because it's either pass fail, you're either doing it or you're not. And I think a lot of organizations tend to take best practice measurements, and they haven't looked at what's actually going to have impact in the organization. That's why it doesn't really work, because they haven't done the legwork to figure out what is going to have the biggest impact, and how are we going to make the most progress. So I think that's part of the problem, kind of very narrow definitions of what those measurements might be and what they can be to be successful. That baseline work I talked about earlier is going to give you a really good idea on how to measure that, making sure that you're encouraging the right behaviors. And when they get treated as if they are check boxes, it's because perhaps that's what it's encouraging, right, in the way that it's being measured. And so if you have the types of measurements that require a certain degree of engagement and collaboration in order to be successful, very similar to the way we do performance management, like how do you make sure you're creating collaboration in the culture? That's another example of that. So that's my take on it. It's maybe a little contrarian, again, to use Ian's terminology earlier, but I think we need something different. Again, this is why I wrote the essay. I'm just so frustrated that there's so many failed DEI and belonging initiatives. And if we want to have different results, we have to do different things. Otherwise, we're all insane, right? So, and maybe we are.
So I'll just add to what Karen just spoke of. I agree with everything that you said, Karen. And I would say that to emphasize her point, there needs to be a partnership, an understanding between a scorecard approach, right, and the numbers of people that are being hired into the organization and promoted, and a cultural people aspect to it, right? The hard part is the culture and people part of it, because as going back to the beginning of this conversation, when Ian talked about you know, what transformational change is and is not, he talked about, you know, if you don't have everybody listening and aligned in some way, shape, or form, and you don't know what you're heading from and going to, then you're going to stumble and fall. So the culture, the experience, the support, the development, all those things need to be in place in order to make the numbers make any sense, or we will continue to see women and underrepresented ethnic group members leave organizations more quickly than their white male counterparts, which just, you know, kills the whole thing, right? Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
And I would just pile on and agree with everything that's been said, but add one other point, which is, measurement and accountability are great right up to the point where you're measuring the wrong things and holding people accountable for the wrong things. And so if you're only measuring, increase in representation, for example, among vice presidents, let's just use that as an example, but you're doing a lousy job and you're not holding people accountable for the work environment they're creating, and for the ability to listen and then respond and act on feedback and input that you're receiving as a leader. And there are ways to measure that too. You have to measure both sides of the equation. And so, I'm all for measurement and accountability. I believe, very strongly in that. But I've seen lots of examples of measuring all the wrong things and putting a lot of effort into creating a dashboard with, yet red, yellow, and green lights and all kinds of reporting going on a weekly, monthly basis, and focusing on all the wrong things, but a very complicated process. So people felt good that there were measures in place. They were just measuring the wrong stuff.
I have an add to this, if I may, and that is the exit interview process. There's a huge opportunity there to interview people that are leaving your organization to understand why, and probing more than the surface answer about why an individual has actually made a decision to go. And that gets to, facing the truth, right? Facing what you don't want to see in an organization. But I find that if an organization is doing that well, then there's data that can be pulled back through to understand what's going on in the culture, which then can positively feed, if people want to be aware of it, how to approach an aspect of change within the culture.
Great. Yeah. If I were to summarize what I heard you all say, it's something along the lines of don't oversimplify what is really a complex set of behaviors that you actually want to hold people accountable to. And I appreciate the question putting in the context of performance management systems, because it's a broader question about performance management and how you measure what really matters and what are the right methodologies and the sources of information to really gather that. Well,
If I could add just one last point to that, Corinne, I would also say don't over complexify things that are actually fairly simple. And we have a tendency to do both in the spirit of trying to lead large scale transformational change, because it is complicated. DEIB is also really complicated. But if we spend all of our energy catering to the complexity, as opposed to simplifying things and doing it in more digestible bites and piloting things and trying stuff and seeing if it works and then building on it from there. If we did a better job of that, we'd actually, I think, make much more progress, frankly.
I think that's a wonderful place to end our conversation. I really want to thank our panelists, Ian Ziskin, Jaw-Madson, and Sophia Kristjansson for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, and your experiences with us. I'd like to encourage everyone to check out the book, The Transformational Secret Sauce for Leading Transformational Change. If you scroll back up through the chat window, there's a link where you can buy it and also a discount code you can use to see more details from our three panelists, as well as other contributors to the book. Before you all leave, I'd just like to make a quick announcement. In March, please join us for our annual DEIB Summit, which is jointly presented by Hart at UCLA and the UCI Mirage School of Business. This in-person event will be held in 2 points and 2 separate dates. One is going to be at the UCI campus in Irvine, and the other is going to be at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in La Canada, Flint Ridge. Thank you to our member company, JPL, for hosting this event on site. If you have any interest in participating, please reach out to Mary Beth Vita Edwards, and she's going to put her email in the chat. And you can always look for upcoming DEIB in-person and virtual events on the Hart website. So with that, once again, thank you all for, thank you to our panelists for sharing your time with us, and thank you to the audience for being here with us. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.